Okay, imagine for a second that climate change, the thing we read about. Imagine it's not some distant threat, but it's right here, right now, affecting people who rely directly on the forest.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, right now. This is the reality for indigenous communities in our Amazon, feeling the effects day in, day out.
Yeah.
So today we're going to do a deep dive into this. We want you to understand what's happening without that feeling of just being overwhelmed by information.
Exactly. Our goal here is to really look at how the climate is impacting the technologies, the traditional ways of life of peoples like the Ticuna and the Marubo, right there in the heart of the Brazilian Amazon.
And where's this information coming from?
Well, it's based on solid ground.
Yeah.
We're looking at research from a postdoctoral study, interviews with indigenous leaders themselves,
Okay.
and we're connecting all that to what we learned back in the 20th century about how human societies and their environments interact, specifically through ecological anthropology.
Right, so this isn't just a today problem. It has deep historical roots.
Absolutely. It's a long story of interaction and, unfortunately, impact.
Okay, so our mission for you listening is clear. We're going to take this complex situation and pull out the key insights. We want you to understand how climate change is affecting these communities and, crucially, why their traditional knowledge is so relevant for everyone's efforts towards sustainability.
Perfect.
Right, let's start with the current crisis. Paint a picture for us. What are they actually facing on the ground?
The situation is pretty dire. I mean, think about depending completely on the land and rivers for survival.
Yeah.
And then suddenly facing relentless droughts, massive fires swallowing the forest. It directly threatens their farming, their fishing, their very ability to survive.
The scale is huge, right? I saw some numbers.
The numbers are staggering. Just in 2024, as of August, over 5.5 million hectares of the Amazon burned.
Wow.
And the Pantanal lost 2.5 million hectares. To give you perspective, WWF Brazil reported over 53,000 separate fire outbreaks. That's an immense area just turned to ash.
Good grief. That's devastating. And the drought seems to be hitting particularly hard, too.
Definitely. A survey from July 2024 showed that 92% of indigenous lands in the legal Amazon were affected by drought.
92%.
Yeah, that's 358 out of 388 reserves. And the effects are immediate and brutal. Real difficulty getting clean water and food, communities getting cut off because rivers become impassable.
So they can't travel.
Exactly. Hunting and fishing become much harder, and just finding safe drinking water is a constant emergency.
You mentioned the legal Amazon, but we know other critical ecosystems in Brazil are also suffering, aren't they?
That's right. I mean, if the Amazon, which historically felt the impact of, let's say, non-indigenous expansion later than other areas, is already in this level of crisis,
Yeah.
then you can imagine the situation in places like the Cerrado Savannah. Some studies suggest parts of the Cerrado could face extinction within maybe 30 years.
Yeah.
And it's also being hit hard by fires this year. The environmental picture across Brazil is extremely concerning.
Understood. That paints a grim picture of the now. But you mentioned this crisis echoes the past through 20th century ecological anthropology. For listeners maybe not familiar with that field, what did it study?
Essentially, ecological anthropology focused on understanding the relationship between human societies, their organization, beliefs, culture, and the natural environment around them.
Well,
Think of the environment as everything outside society that directly influences how it works. And what's fascinating is how this field evolved through the 20th century. Initially, back in the 40s and 50s, there was a strong school of thought, cultural ecology, that saw the environment as largely determining culture.
like a very cold climate means people build certain houses, wear certain clothes, that kind of logic.
Precisely that line of thinking. But then, starting around the 60s, ecological anthropology emerged, partly as a reaction against that determinism.
Okay, how so?
It started focusing more on how human populations adapt within ecosystems, taking a more biological, more multidisciplinary view. There was a critique of the idea that the environment shaped everything, and a move towards seeing a much more complex, dynamic interaction.
Interesting. And who are some of the key figures doing this work in Brazil?
In Brazil, Roberto Cardoso de Oliveira's work is really important, especially his research on the curare complex among the Ticuna. And that story about curare poison connects directly to the challenges they face today, as we'll see.
Okay, keep that in mind. Who else?
And also, Berta Gleiser Ribeiro. She developed this really interesting concept called techeconomia.
Techeconomia.
Yeah. For her, indigenous technology wasn't just the tool itself, like a blowgun or a basket. It included the whole social organization, the knowledge, the practices behind the tool. She was very interested in how wider Brazilian society could potentially learn sustainable practices embedded within these indigenous technologies.
That's a fascinating concept. And before these figures, was there already interest in this people-nature connection?
Oh, yes. Even before ecological anthropology became a distinct field, you had studies in the 19th and early 20th centuries exploring human adaptability, especially to the human tropics.
Right.
People were trying to understand how populations lived in these regions, used resources, dealt with challenges. Early on, there was that influence from American cultural ecology emphasizing the environment's role. But figures like Franz Boas pushed back, arguing for a degree of cultural autonomy from nature.
So there was always a bit of debate. It wasn't just one view.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And several other Brazilian intellectuals made really valuable contributions to understanding what we now might call indigenous ethnosciences, traditional knowledge about plants, medicine, what Bertrand Barrow also called the arts of life.
Who were some of them?
Names like Edgar Roque Pinto, Raimundo Lopes, Charles Waigley, Luis de Castro Faria, Gaston Cruz, who actually had connections with Gilberto Frere. Interestingly enough, Adolfo Duck, Barbosa Rodriguez, Paulo Carneiro. Each, in their own way, helped build this understanding of indigenous knowledge and practices. And the key takeaway here, the real connection, is realizing that these 20th century studies, focusing on indigenous knowledge and sustainable practices, might hold vital clues for tackling our 21st century environmental crisis.
Wow, that's a powerful link between past research and present problems. So how do environmental history and this idea of the Anthropocene fit into the conversation?
Well, environmental history is the field that specifically investigates these interactions between human societies and the natural world over time. Think of the historian Fernand Braudel concept of the longue durée, looking at processes over long timescales.
Right, the long view.
And then you have the concept of the Anthropocene, which basically marks our current geological epoch. It's defined by the massive global impact humans are having on the planet. Scientists Paul Cresson and Eugene Stormer really popularized that term around the year 2000.
So the impacts we're seeing now on indigenous technologies are part of this longer history of interaction and this planetary scale human impact.
Absolutely, no question. Remember we mentioned Roberto Cardoso de Oliveira's 1959 study on the ticuna and curare?
Yes, the poison production declining.
Right. Even back then, he noted, its production, vital for hunting and fishing, was decreasing because of contact with non-indigenous society. Now, fast forward to 2024, and the accounts are even more alarming.
What are people saying now?
Professor Cleobina Torres Florentino, who is ticuna herself, reports that essential plants are simply disappearing because the Rio Salmoense is experiencing such severe droughts. And Beto Marubo, from the Vale de Javari region, highlights the risk of starvation for isolated communities because the animals they traditionally hunt are dying from the drought and the smoke from fires.
That's heartbreaking. So if things were already being impacted back in the late 50s, the situation must be incredibly urgent now with the climate crisis intensifying everything.
Precisely. And to really understand this reality, we need to hear directly from those living it.
The indigenous peoples themselves.
Yes. Interviews were conducted recently in July and August of 2024 with representatives of the Ticuna people, Cleobina Torres Florentino, who we just mentioned, and Jose Fernandez Mendonça, and also with Beto Marubo representing the Marubo people. It's crucial we listen to their perspectives.
Okay, so what did these leaders share? What were the main points from those interviews? Let's start with Cleobina.
Cleobina detailed some of the traditional sustainable land management techniques her people use, like capoeira, which involves rotating cultivated areas to let the soil recover.
Smart.
Very. But she also pointed out the growing scarcity of natural resources. That's due to population increase, yes, but also the fires and river pollution.
And the climate changes.
Absolutely. She talked about the devastating impact of prolonged droughts and also unexpected floods on their agriculture and fishing. This leads directly to food insecurity, and it even affects children's education when families struggle.
How?
If families can't produce food or access resources, kids might have to help more, or families might even need to relocate temporarily, disrupting schooling. She also mentioned that many animal and fish species that used to be abundant are just gone.
Wow.
Cleobina made an urgent plea for public policies that actually integrate indigenous knowledge into environmental preservation efforts. She warned that predatory resource exploitation threatens not just biodiversity, but their very survival. For her, traditional knowledge isn't just history. It's a vital tool for tackling the global environmental crisis.
A powerful message. What about Jose Fernandez Mendonça, also from the Ticuna people? What were his main concerns?
Jose really emphasized the critical importance of preserving indigenous culture and traditions. He also stressed how climate change is causing unprecedented destruction in their communities, reminding us that nature is absolutely essential for their existence.
What specific challenges did he mention?
He described the huge difficulties they face due to drought, food shortages, and also territorial invasions by miners and farmers in the Alto Solomones region.
So climate change plus direct human pressure.
Exactly. He also mentioned threats from pirates on the Rio Solomones, environmental destruction, and rampant deforestation. The severe drought just makes everything worse, killing fish, hindering transportation, making it hard to get medical care.
It sounds overwhelming.
It does. But despite all this, Jose also spoke about the community's efforts to keep the Ticuna language and culture alive through indigenous education in their schools. And he ended with a stark warning. Environmental preservation is non-negotiable for the survival of indigenous populations.
And what perspective did Beto Marubo bring from the Vale du Javari?
Beto painted a deeply worrying picture there, too. He said that over the last 5 years, agriculture and fishing have been severely hit by both prolonged droughts and floods happening completely out of season.
Unpredictability is key then.
Totally. The current drought is making transport difficult and hindering the cultivation of essential crops, like bananas and cassava. Fish are dying not just from lack of water, but also from intensified friagens amazonicas, those sudden cold spells.
Really? Colder spells too.
Yes, as part of the destabilized weather patterns. He explained that rainfall, which used to be predictable, is now completely erratic. This affects agriculture, it affects forest animals, and it puts enormous pressure on indigenous communities, including those living in voluntary isolation.
And what about solutions or policy?
Beto criticized the lack of adequate public policies to address these escalating issues. He warned that parts of the Amazon could literally become uninhabitable in the coming decades if things don't change.
Uninhabitable?
He specifically advocated for food policies tailored to indigenous people's needs and called for much greater collaboration between scientists and traditional communities.
Hearing these direct accounts is just incredibly powerful. You really feel that deep connection they have with their environment and the devastating consequences when it's disrupted. And the call for recognizing traditional knowledge comes through so strongly.
It really does. And when we zoom out to look at the broader environmental picture in Brazil, the situation nationally is also quite alarming. Well, CO2 emissions are high. In 2021, Brazil emitted over 2.4 billion gross tons, which was a big jump from 2020. And in 2024, according to IBGE data, most municipalities across the country reported environmental problems, fires, deforestation, river silting being the most common.
And the fires, we touched on the Amazon and Pantanal, but nationally?
Nationally, the area burned in Brazil in 2024 was up 79% compared to 2023. We're talking almost 31 million hectares by late in the year. That's an area larger than Italy.
Larger than Italy? That's hard to even conceptualize.
It is. There were record numbers of fire outbreaks in the Amazon, the highest since 2007. Huge increases in the Pantanal, massive increases in the Cerrado as well compared to the previous year.
Just fires everywhere, it seems. What are the main drivers behind this surge in 2024?
It's seen as a kind of perfect storm. Intense heat waves, an early start to the dry season in some areas, lingering effects of the El Niño phenomenon on rainfall patterns, plus abnormal warming in the North Tropical Atlantic Ocean, and, underlying it all, record global temperatures.
A complex mix of factors. How is the general public in Brazil feeling about all this? Is there much concern?
Actually, yes. Polls consistently show a high level of environmental concern in Brazil, often higher than many other countries.
Really?
Yeah. Polls from CNI, IPEC, IPSOS in recent years show this. A significant number of Brazilians identify as environmentally conscious consumers. They report trying to adopt sustainable habits, using reusable bags, saving water, reducing emissions where possible, recycling.
That's encouraging.
And awareness of climate change is high. Most people believe global warming is happening, attribute it mainly to human activities, and worry about the harm to future generations. Deforestation, especially in the Amazon, is widely seen as a major threat.
Okay, so there's public awareness and concern. What about scientific research on the environment in Brazil? Is that growing too?
It seems so. If you look at databases like CAPES, which tracks theses and dissertations, there's been a noticeable increase in academic work on topics like environment, ecology, climate crisis, climate change, Anthropocene, and environmental history.
So more research is happening.
More research is happening, yes. But there are some critical perspectives to consider, too. One study back in 2020 found that, worryingly, A vast majority, like 97% of environmental impact assessments in Brazil, were deemed unsatisfactory.
97%. That's not good.
Not good at all. And another study from 2021 pointed out that only about a quarter of published articles in conservation biology actually focused on proposing concrete solutions to the problems they identified.
So there's a gap between identifying problems and proposing actionable solutions, or maybe ensuring the quality of impact assessments.
That seems to be a concern, yeah. It raises important questions about how effective the research is in translating into real-world action and policy.
Which brings us back to needing practical solutions. How can we better connect different fields of knowledge to tackle these complex environmental challenges?
Well, an interdisciplinary approach is absolutely key. We really need to bring together history, the social sciences, and the natural sciences.
How does each contribute?
History gives us that long-term perspective. Social sciences help us understand the human dynamics, the societal structures, power relations, how communities interact with their environment. And natural sciences provide the fundamental understanding of ecosystems and climate processes.
Makes sense.
But it's not just about academics talking to each other. We need much stronger interaction between researchers, the public, civil society, and policymakers who are actually creating and implementing environmental policies.
And education plays a role.
A huge role. We need what some call critical environmental education. Education that's engaging, transformative, that considers local realities and promotes integrated, hands-on projects. It shouldn't just be about facts, it should empower action.
Right.
And throughout all this, we have to remember the intrinsic link between protecting biodiversity and achieving social justice. The contributions of traditional populations, like the indigenous communities we've discussed, are vital for sustainability. We need to recognize and support their local resistance and adaptation efforts.
Absolutely. It seems clear that environmental issues and social issues are deeply intertwined here. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway you hope listeners hold on to?
I think the main thing is the sheer immediacy and depth of the climate change impact on indigenous communities in the Amazon. They're on the front lines, incredibly vulnerable, and they're losing irreplaceable traditional knowledge and resources at an alarming rate.
But there's another side to that coin.
Yes. At the same time, their knowledge, their wisdom, their practices honed over centuries are absolutely crucial for understanding and ultimately addressing the climate crisis. It's something those anthropologists back in the 20th century were already beginning to recognize.
A crucial resource we can't afford to lose. Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder. Given everything we've discussed, the interconnectedness of history, environment, society, and the urgent lived realities of indigenous communities, what responsibility do we have? What's our role in supporting their resilience and actively integrating their wisdom into the global push for a more sustainable future? Something to think about.